There is majestic drama in a winter forest, subjected to high winds. The wind rushes swiftly between the trees, calling out in its whistling gusts. People in winter costumes look like characters from a fairy tale. Their warm jackets, hats, and mittens create a contrast with the snow-white background, and every step they take is accompanied by the characteristic squeak of snow under their feet. The two boys, despite the strong wind, persisted in their journey deeper into the forest. Their steps were determined, and they walked side by side, supporting each other. They didn't understand how they got here, because their memory was erased. They found themselves in another world. The guy with the weapon carefully peered into the distance and asked if his partner saw something. The latter also tensed, focusing his gaze in the same direction, and answered positively. A lone tree stood in a field covered with a deep layer of fresh snow, its branches covered with white drifts. From one of the branches dangled a rope, the end of which was tied round the man's neck. Near this tree lay a crashed helicopter, its wreckage scattered across the snow-covered surface. Two guys standing next to the crashed helicopter and a man tied to a tree started discussing the situation. One of the guys suggested that it might be a suicide attempt. For some reason, he had decided to end his life in this place. The load in the wagon tapped as it slid across the ice. The sounds of these heavy objects were probably like a monotonous rhythm in this bleak winter forest. From the sled, which was covered with a cloth, bags of belongings were visible. The blanket was gently drooping over these bags, creating mysterious contours and shapes underneath. The bags were probably filled with clothes and food. Their outlines could be seen through the cloth. The black-haired, hooded guy was sympathetic to the suicidal man's act, saying that it could have happened to anyone at such a difficult time. The men in winter suits noticed strange sounds that resembled the menacing roar of a beast. They were frightened by these intimidating sounds, and their hearts beat faster. With tense glances at each other, they decided to cautiously approach the source of the roar. The men must have expected to see a beast, but to their surprise, they found that the sounds were coming from something quite unusual. Under a layer of snow lay a zombie, almost completely hidden from view. It was a strange and frightening sight. The black-haired guy with visible signs of discipline and professionalism was a sergeant. His confident demeanor and attentive gaze indicated that he held a military rank. The sergeant's partner suddenly asked him to pay attention to the zombie's uniform, and pointed to an emphatic mark on her uniform. The uniform of the rising dead bore a high-ranking insignia. It was a strange and surprising moment that caused mixed feelings in the men. It was as if it hinted that this zombie had once been a military man, and maybe even a sergeant like the guy. The zombie, who had a rank on his uniform, suddenly came into motion and attacked the guys. His actions were clumsy and slow, but his arms stretched forward, eager to grab his victims. Suddenly, when the partner was ready to pull out his knife, he outran the sergeant, rushing forward. Before attacking the zombie, the partner stopped for a moment, and apparently recognizing the high rank on the zombie's uniform, expressed respect and apologized to him. The blonde-haired guy with a look of determination on his face was resolutely stabbing straight at the face of the one who had risen from the dead. His movements were swift and precise, and each blow was intended to strike the zombie and neutralize it. His partner, after many blows, removed his knife from the body of the fallen zombie with palpable relief. It was the moment when he realized that the threat had been neutralized and he could catch his breath. The knife was stained with the zombie's blood and brains, but now he could use it again if he needed to. The men stood in the middle of the snow-covered field, their silhouettes contrasting with the bright white background. One of them stood clutching a weapon in his hand, his gaze focused on the surrounding area, vigilantly scanning for danger. From somewhere far away came a mysterious click that broke the silence of the field. The sound pierced the air, causing the men to turn instantly in the direction of the source of the sound, tensely preparing for any new threat that might creep up on them. The sergeant heard that some mysterious voice had not recorded the biometric data. This sound made him more attentive, and he exchanged glances with his comrade, realizing that something strange was going on in this gloomy, snow-covered area. The black-haired guy, with raised eyebrows, turned to his partner and asked what it was. There was a note of surprise and bewilderment in his voice, as the noise from an unknown source had caused them both bewilderment and concern. The man tied by the neck to the cable was suddenly a zombie. His steps were heavy and clumsy, and his eyes had lost their former meaning. The sergeant felt fear begin to clench his throat as the zombie slowly but inevitably drew closer. A zombie in a green sweatshirt with pale skin and blood dripping from his mouth was approaching, his gaze blank and lifeless, and his appearance expressing an inhuman thirst. A zombie with torn skin on his face and veins protruding from his forehead came close to the black-haired boy, his wrinkled face as if mangled by inhuman suffering. A zombie with a severed arm stood directly in front of the sergeant, his abnormal state making the scene even more grim. The sergeant slowly and decisively brought the muzzle of the rifle closer to the zombie's head. His hand trembled with tension, and at that moment, the man's gaze was full of mixed feelings, fear and determination. The man, realizing the danger, covered himself with his hand to avoid contact with the zombie's blood. His gesture was another side of the gruesome reality he was forced to cope with. The action reminded him how disgusting the situation was, and on the verge of surviving this nightmare. The sergeant did not hesitate, but took aim and shot straight at the monster's head. The shot blew the zombie's head apart, and blood spattered into the air. This bloody finale robbed the zombie of its last spark of life, forever destroying its danger. The man standing still could not hide his emotions in front of this gruesome picture. Droplets of blood from the zombie's severed head landed on the sergeant's arm, which he was covering himself with. The liquid, bloody drops felt like an eerie reminder of how dangerous this world was, and how important it was to remain vigilant in a post-apocalyptic reality. The sergeant stood with his rifle in his hands, his gaze fixed on the body of the zombie lying in the snow. At that moment, the world around him seemed vast and dead, and the snow beneath his feet was a silent witness to this gruesome fight. The black-haired boy felt a mishmash of emotions inside him: relief, fear, and at the same time sadness that the world he knew was gone forever. His partner ran up to the sergeant, his face a look of concern on his face, and he asked if everything was all right. The sergeant nodded, realizing that being alone with a threat in a post-apocalyptic world could be deadly, and he was grateful for his partner's support. Their joint survival was their top priority in this ruthless reality. The man was relieved to throw off the sledge rope and head for the documents that were his first priority. He realized that time was worth its weight in gold in this dangerous world, and his thirst for information drove him forward. The sergeant leaned over the suitcase of records, examining them carefully. His partner surmised that it might be something important, given the risk they had to overcome to get to those documents. At that moment, they realized that the information inside the suitcase could prove to be the key to understanding the changes that had taken place during this dark time. The chief agreed with the blonde man's words, realizing the importance of the contents of the suitcase. As he flipped through the pages, his eyes slid over the records, and they both sensed that it might contain information that would change their perception of the world they had to survive in. The sergeant's attention was suddenly drawn to some sort of squeak coming from the suitcase. He paused and concentrated on this sound, which seemed unusual in this gloomy environment. It turned out that the beeping was coming from a small card that was attached to a lanyard. The sergeant pulled it out and examined it closely. The card looked unusual and could possibly contain a secret message or directions to something important in their fight for survival. The man scrutinized the card, and suddenly his eyes fell on the text that said, "There was a bunker in case of disaster." His heart quickened at the possibility of finding a safe haven in this devastated world. The text offered hope and direction, and the sergeant resolutely took the card with him, knowing that it could change everything. The boy suddenly realized that the text on the card spoke of a key to the bunker in case of disaster. His eyes widened with surprise and joy, realizing that they had finally found the long-awaited key to salvation and safety. The sergeant, looking over the mysterious card, turned to the private to give him an important instruction, his voice insistent and determined. The man turned to Kim Chan and said that they needed to move towards the Force Defense Command. His voice was full of confidence, and he expressed the importance of this decision. The private nodded in understanding and got ready to follow the sergeant, ready to carry out his command. The sergeant took a deep breath and began to speak with confidence in his voice that he and his partner would be able to reach the target in 10 days because of their experience and training. But suddenly his speech was interrupted by a loud noise in the distance, causing everyone to glance in that direction. The snow abruptly began to blow around, as if small breezes of wind had picked up each snowflake and made them part of the vortex. White crystals soared into the air and glittered against the gray sky. The sergeant turned around sharply and, with eyes full of sternness, ordered Private Kim to step back, his voice sounding firm and authoritative, sending a clear and unambiguous message that the order must be obeyed. The sergeant only had time to shout, "Now!" before he lost his balance and suddenly fell down the slope. His voice was filled with determination and eagerness to support his partner, but his unfortunate positioning caused him to lose his balance, and he fell to the ground. His figure disappeared behind the tons of snow. The sergeant rolled down the cliff with his documents, holding his rifle. His eyes expressed terror as he plummeted downwards, feeling helpless against the inescapable force of gravity. The man landed unluckily right on his head, causing snow to fly everywhere in all directions like a white fountain, creating a colorful but comical spectacle. The sergeant was lying face down on the ground after his unfortunate fall, with some kind of black car standing beside him. At this time, the private ran to the edge of the cliff and, watching from above, excitedly asked if the sergeant was all right, expressing concern and worry for his commander. The guy gradually lifted his head up, clearing it of snow, and at the same time, the doors in the car began to open, and snow began to fall from the inside to the outside through them. This sudden snowfall from inside the car added mystery and tension to the situation, creating an imposing effect that made the sergeant freeze in anticipation of further events. The agitated boy tried to catch his breath coming out of his mouth in clouds of visible vapor in the cold. Excitement and fear made his breathing quicken, and each exhalation was labored, slowly disappearing into the cold air. Someone's hand began to emerge from the door of the mysterious car, peering out like a zombie's hand. It was pale green, covered in snow and ice, and slowly stretched towards the sergeant. The sight caused a feeling of terror and indescribable anxious anticipation inside the man present. The sergeant's breath froze for a moment as he saw that horrifying image. His hand clutching the grip of his automatic weapon froze, and he felt a cold sweat on his forehead. Shock and horror overwhelmed him, and he could not understand how this could have happened. The sergeant, still in a state of shock, saw the fingers of the zombie hand begin to move slowly. He watched as the fingers, covered in earth and snow, went up and down as if trying to grab something. This creepy gesture further heightened his sense of terror, and he was paralyzed, not knowing what to do. The man, recovering from the shock, slowly rose from the ground, rifle clutched firmly to his shoulder. He was resolved and ready to act. Slowly and carefully, he aimed his rifle at the car from which the dead man's arm was sticking out. At that moment, the sergeant was scared to the core. His eyes expressed absolute fear, and his face was pale, as if he were having his own zombie nightmares. The sergeant stared at the zombies in deep horror, trying to convey his anxious plea to them through his words and facial expression. He silently spread his arms out towards the car, as if trying to stop them from getting out. His eyes, full of fear, spoke more than words, and he hoped they would understand his gesture as a plea for caution. The atmosphere around the sergeant was dark and tense. The snow-covered forest created a dead silence, interrupted only by the rustling of branches in the cold wind. The car, from which the monster's hand peered out, stood as a mute witness to the terrible event. From the ajar doors of the car, zombie heads began to slowly emerge in the shadows, their outlines barely discernible due to the lack of light. Only their grim silhouettes were visible, but the details remained hidden. This looming in terror as the monsters emerged from the darkness created even more tension, as it was impossible to tell how many of them there were or what their appearance was. The sergeant realized with surprise and horror that the zombies that had emerged from the shadows had small heads. Children. Their pale faces and blank stares mingled with the cold atmosphere, creating a sight that broke all notions of fear. Now he was facing not only the threat, but also the tragic aspect of this nightmare. The growling zombies, as if reacting to the tension around them, opened the car doors abruptly. The sound of creaking and banging doors cut through the silence of the forest, and with it, a roaring chorus of children's voices abruptly erupted. This sonic explosion mixed fear and surprise, making the man realize even more deeply that he was facing unimaginable terror. The vicious dead with bloody teeth burst out of the car and exhaled violently, their breath sounding like a hoarse shriek mixed with animalistic snarls. Their predatory grins reeked of inhuman fury, creating a grim picture of twisted aggression. One of the monsters, once a long-haired girl, now lay face down in the snow. In her dead eyes, the sparkle that had once been playful was gone, and her snow-covered hair provided a grim contrast to her former childlike innocence. The sergeant watched with fading hope in his eyes as the zombies climbed out of the car despite his silent pleading. His gaze flashed with displeasure and disappointment, as if he realized that the situation was now even more complicated. The zombie children began to crawl along the ground towards the sergeant. Their movements were clumsy and animalistic, as if they had no human pride. There was some frightening determination in every step as they approached the man, creating a grim picture of impending terror. The man looked at the creatures crawling towards him and was utterly shocked to realize that these lifeless figures had once been children. His eyes reflected not only the horror of the zombie menace, but also the unspeakable shock that in this nightmare, the children were victims of an inhuman plague. That moment pierced his soul, filling him with horror and powerless grief. The risen from the dead, full of anger, approached the sergeant faster and faster. Their movements showed a furious rage that gave speed and aggression to their dead bodies. The boy felt a wave of anger rushing towards him, creating a hopeless situation. The sergeant clutched his weapon and prepared for the inevitable fight with the zombie. His movements were resolute, and his gaze was filled with unwavering determination. The sound of the click of the machine gun being prepared broke the silence of the forest, creating an atmosphere of the coming fight. The zombies, feeling a sinister energy, ran at the man. Their steps were clumsy but aggressive, as if pursuit had become an urgent mission for them. The sergeant, standing guard with a sense of strained gaze, met the oncoming threat, ready for a battle that seemed like an endless forest nightmare. The boy, without expressing himself, clearly made it clear that his patience was at an end. His gaze read determination, and he prepared for action. He said that if the monsters came any closer, he would be forced to use his weapon in defense of his life. The zombies, like dark shadows, instantly increased their speed and ran at the sergeant. Their dark figures were woven into the outline of the forest, creating an ominous picture of the impending threat. The sergeant, with unwavering determination, began firing at the advancing zombies. The gunshots shattered the silence of the forest, leaving a thunderous trail of menacing struggle in the air. The bullet darted straight at the running zombie child's head, instantly throwing her backwards. Tension was in the air at that moment, and the fatal shot interrupted the child's running body, causing it to immediately collapse into the snow. That brief moment was a sad response to the darkness and aggression present in this nightmare. The sergeant, with coolness in his eyes, promptly reloaded his rifle. His movements were precise and automatic, as if he had practiced the action 1,000 times. The characteristic sound of the click of the bolt following the reloading broke the evening silence, filling it with military readiness. The sergeant didn't hesitate and fired at the zombie boy. The sound of the shot pierced the air, and the bullet was precisely aimed at the target, tearing through the darkness that hid the terrifying threat. The zombie, whose arm had been torn off by the sergeant's shot, leapt at him with unstoppable aggression. The man, reacting instantly, covered himself with his weapon, trying to fend off the attack. Tension was in the air as life and death once again came together in a battle. The battle between human survival and merciless deadness erupted in a lightning-fast clash. The zombie, missing one arm and bleeding with the gloom of death, flew unstoppably closer and closer to the sergeant. Its movements were mangled, but there was a manic persistence evident in their clumsiness. Tension hung in the air as the mangled figure rushed forward, eager to attack the man. The zombie, like the embodiment of desperation and aggression, gnawed at the sergeant's rifle. Its mangled teeth, covered in dark blood, sank into the cold metal of the weapon. A moment of tension expressed itself in the sound of gnashing as the monster tried to pierce through the military steel with its teeth. The sergeant, clutching his rifle with vigor, fought for control, feeling the dead man trying to breach the last barrier of his defenses. The boy, sensing the zombie's power, pulled back slightly under the pressure of the unbridled force. His eyes flashed with surprise and concern as the creature continued to push, creating a struggle between human and undead. That step backwards was a brief moment of loss of control that the sergeant immediately tried to regain, realizing that every step in this fight had a price. The zombie, and the darkness and power emanating from it, pressed harder and harder on the sergeant's weapon. There was an ominous creaking sound in the dark forest as the black-haired lad's weapon succumbed to this unimaginable pressure. It was a duel between the remnants of human will and the infinite power of dead arms, or rather hands. The monster's teeth, like steel pincers of death, crunched against the sergeant's rifle. The sound of the clash was like an ominous murmur, a reminder that an indomitable rage had awakened in these dead creatures. The man felt this sound in every fiber of his being, knowing that it was a challenge to human fortitude in the face of the merciless dead. The sergeant, with a voice that carried fatigue and despair, asked the zombie to stop. His words sounded like a last attempt to negotiate with this dead thing, as if he was calling for an exodus from this nightmare. In his eyes flickered a plea to stop this endless circle of horror. The zombie opened its mouth, slowly approaching the sergeant. Its lifeless eyes glimmered with emptiness, and the opening of its mouth created an eerie foreboding. With each movement toward the man, the silent specter grew closer, frightening in its appearance. The sergeant, full of anger and despair, couldn't take it anymore and shouted out, "You fucking zombie!" His words pierced the silence of the forest, creating an echo within the gloom. At that moment, human despair and rage mingled, bursting out in an angry exclamation that reflected the collision of humanity with an absurd threat. The sergeant, overcome with excitement and tension, shoved the zombie away. His movements were sharp, and the power of the rifle clutched in his hand transferred into a powerful pushing gesture. In a moment of excitement, the monster found itself thrown backwards, as if the man's strength had taken over the lifeless menace. The moment gave the sergeant at least a brief pause in the war against the dead. The zombie, recoiling under the sergeant's force, fell unsteadily into the snow. The grim figure, devoid of human life, lost its verticality and melted into the whiteness of the snow. This motionless image on the aphid of cold nature created a frightening contrast, as if death were drowning in the vast whiteness of the forest. Under the force of the sergeant's repulsion, blood spurted from the zombie's mouth. The dark red stain against the pale face created an eerie sight, symbolizing not only the inhumanity of the dead, but also the brief return of signs of life in this bleak world. The zombie, through a horrifying wheeze, uttered, as if expelling words from decomposed lungs, "The living must live." This sound of the inhuman voice brought a mysterious note into the darkness of the scene, as if the dead man had glimpsed a shard of human wisdom in his stillness. The dead man rose abruptly from the ground, filling the air with his sudden presence, and ran at the sergeant. The growl emitted by this lifeless creature seemed like the rasping of an animal voice, and its running was clumsy, but full of undeniable aggression. In the dark forest, the sound of its approach became a harbinger of danger, coming with all deadly fury. The sergeant, with an insistent stare, took aim at the approaching zombie. In his hands, the rifle represented an integral part of his quest for survival. In anticipation of the inevitable encounter, the silence of the forest was tense, a foretaste of the imminent shot that would determine the outcome of this terrible encounter. The sergeant, with a strained look, pulled the trigger, and a distinctive click sounded in the silent forest. The sound was like an echo of the decisive moment, the moment when steel meets flesh in the struggle for survival. In the shadows of the forest, that click was a kind of response to an unknown threat, creating a spiral of the dark dance of death. Something caught the man's attention, as if something had happened to the weapon. His face reflected uncertain anxiety, and droplets of sweat dripped down like raindrops, expressing excitement and uncertainty. This moment of surprise broke the confidence in the weapon, forcing the sergeant to fight not only the zombie, but also his inner doubts. The one-eyed and armless zombie, like the epitome of tenacity, ran towards the sergeant with unrestrained vigor. Its limping steps were filled with fierce determination, despite the loss of limbs. A deafening roar resounded through the dark forest as the disfigured dead man sped forward, creating a terrifying spectacle. The sergeant, with a focused gaze, fired at the zombie, and the shell casing flew from the bolt, instantly breaking the silence of the forest. The sound of the shot was accompanied by a mechanical pop, emphasizing the seriousness of the fight in this dark corner of the world. In the shadows of the forest, the moment looked like a bright glimmer of determination in a twilight struggle. The man, in a rush, reloaded his rifle with hurried movements. His hands worked like a machine gun, quickly and accurately, replacing the cartridge and moving the bolt. The sound of metal on metal accompanying the reloading broke the silence of the forest, creating an atmosphere of intense preparation for the next encounter with the threat. The sergeant, having finished reloading with impeccable force, aimed again at the approaching dead man. His gaze was like an apt beam of light in a dark forest, focusing on the looming threat. In that moment, tension was in the air, creating an aura of unwavering determination around the sergeant. The sergeant's partner called out to him with anxiety in his voice, fearing for the man's life. There was a note of anxiety in the muffled exclamation of the fair-haired lad, for in this gloomy scene every moment could be the last. The call of his partner was a warning in the forest, reminding him of the presence of enemies in the shadows, ready to strike. The sergeant, with a firm voice, ordered his partner to stay put. His command sounded like a decisive commandment in the dark forest, where every action had its consequences. The man's words sounded like a concern for safety, a desire to protect a friend in this vast nightmare. The sergeant, with a confident gesture, pointed the muzzle of his rifle directly at the zombie. His movements were precise and decisive, creating a moment of unyielding readiness in the air. At that moment, with the barrel of the weapon pointed directly at the dead man's face, there was a silence, as if it were a foreshadowing of the impending shot that would decide the outcome of this endless battle. The sergeant, with cold-blooded determination, pointed his rifle directly at the zombie's eye. At that moment, his attention focused on the point of contact, creating tension in the air. The muzzle of the weapon pointed toward the dead thing, as if expressing a clear intention to confront the threat until the last shot was fired. The muzzle of the rifle pierced the zombie's eye, like an arrow of truth piercing the black cover of a lifeless gaze. The moment of piercing became a symbol of the confrontation between human resolve and undead menace. The muffled snarl of the dead rang out in the dark forest as steel met rotting flesh in a merciless symphony of survival. After the shot was fired, the cartridge case fell out of the bolt again, proclaiming its ephemerality in this moment of struggle. The metal pedal of freedom crumbled downwards, warning that every shot carries a price and a risk in this merciless dance of death. The sergeant fired his rifle, and the bullet tore through the zombie's head. In an instant, full of power and destruction, black clouds of death soared into the air, creating a grim contrast to the surrounding nature. The devastating shot sent blood flying everywhere like dark wine, coloring the surrounding world in shades of agony. The zombie, subdued by the force of the shot, rolled slowly to the ground like a marionette in the hands of a fatal fate presented to it by its puppeteer. The dead look of that menacing creature dimmed as his body, bereft of will, collapsed on the cold snow, completing its dark dance in that ominous forest. The sergeant, almost falling himself from the powerful recoil of the shot, felt his body sway under the force. The sergeant, forced to rest, was trying to regain his breath after an intense fight with the threat. His chest rose and fell under the strain, and each breath was like an attempt to fill his lungs with oxygen, taking away the fatigue and tension. In these moments of rest in the winter forest, he was gathering strength for the next stage of his battle with the dead. The man looked at the bodies of the zombies, who had once been children, lying before him. His eyes reflected not only a sense of victory, but also a deep shadow of regret and loss, for they too had once been human. In these lifeless forms, he saw fragments of a past life lost in a vortex of chaos and fear, a sight that reminded him of what innocence becomes in the merciless reality of survival. The sergeant clutched his weapon resolutely, as if his fist concentrated all the courage and determination necessary to continue the fight. The metal of the rifle yielded to his strength, and his every movement seemed to be a response to the darkness and threat around him. His partner, standing off to the side, didn't realize whether he could approach the man or not. Uncertainty flickered in his eyes as he glanced at the focused sergeant. In this moment of unknown danger, the black-haired man's non-verbal signals remained cryptic, and the private hesitated, not knowing how best to support his comrade in this difficult moment. The sergeant, picking up documents scattered in the snow, commanded his partner to stand by. The chaos of white sheets and instructions in his hands reflected the need to put their plans in order. Ice cracked beneath the man's foot as he gathered his papers. The sound of ice cracking penetrated the silence of the snowy forest, reminding them of the fragility of the environment on their perilous journey. In that instant, even nature submitted to the weight of their task, creating an added element of tension in this cold but vast world. The sergeant stared in wonder at the murky ice, his gaze frozen in the mysterious depths. The murky veil of water, like a curtain of mystery, caused him questions and bewilderment. At that moment, the icy landscape was revealing its secrets, forcing the man to ponder the nature of what might lie beneath that opaque cover. The depth of the pond mesmerized the sergeant, his gaze deepening into the dark mysteries beneath the icy surface. The murky shadows and vague outlines gave him a sense of the unknown and mysterious, as if the water abyss concealed incredible secrets. This moment of immersion in the unknown world of water created an atmosphere of exciting attraction. Somewhere under the water, the man noticed someone's hair slowly stirring in the dark element. This unforeseen sign of a living presence caused him a sense of inner, unsettling bewilderment. In the water, where silence usually reigned, the mysterious hair became an unlikely symbol of the riddle that was to be solved. It turned out to be a zombie, with air bubbles emanating from its mouth, popping to the surface of the water like a macabre signal of life in this grim underwater world. The air bubbles, accompanied by the emerald glow of rotting flesh, created something mystical and disgusting, revealing its terrible secret underwater. In the water, more than a dozen zombies could be seen among the ruins of some city. Their mangled bodies, covered in algae and mud, stood like ghosts of a lost civilization. Greenish shadows protruded from their eyes and wounds, and some had slow air bubbles coming out of their mouths, reminding them that they were the living dead, now doomed to wander endlessly underwater. The ruins of the flooded city provided an ominous backdrop for this macabre ballet of foulness. The private began to worry about the sergeant, noticing how pale his face had become in the light of the melting ice. Shadows of anxiety were reflected in his eyes as he looked at his commander, previously so determined and steadfast. The sergeant's pale face was a symbol not only of the melting ice, but also of the irreversible changes in their surroundings. The private, feeling the urge to help the sergeant, approached the slippery slope of the icy mountain to climb down. However, a sudden setback in the form of unstable ice knocked him off his feet, and he began to slide down the mountain. At this point, fear and helplessness gripped the private as he lost control and gained speed with each passing second, despite his attempts to slow his fall. The sergeant, despite his inner turmoil, exploded indignantly at the private as he drove off the mountain and found himself at his feet. The man bellowed at his partner, for the latter was supposed to be vigilant. Disobedience in such situations could cost the boys dearly. The sergeant held the scattered papers that were melting in his hands. He was rapidly gathering the papers, trying to restore the lost order despite the circumstances. Kim Chanu, rising to his feet amidst the snow and ice, met the sergeant's indignant gaze. But instead of making excuses, he said firmly that he could not abandon his commander in such a difficult moment, because they were here together, and the private was willing to help the sergeant through it. There was sincerity in his words, and a willingness to support his commander, despite the trouble. The private's determination created an atmosphere of unity around them, even when natural and human elements tried to break that bond. The sergeant, holding the collected documents in his hands, headed towards his destination. The snow slowly melted under his boots, leaving footprints on the flooded path. The water rustled beneath each step, as if reminding him of the fickleness of his surroundings. The gray clouds, leaving the imprint of the sunset on the water surface, added to the atmosphere of drama. The sergeant, realizing that the situation was becoming increasingly difficult, decided to carry out an evacuation. He looked around at the flooded landscape and gathered his thoughts. The man told Kim that they should leave the place, sensing the growing threat in the water and the dangers lurking. He endeavored to remain calm and determined, even as natural and human factors created chaos around them. Evacuation became an urgent task, and the sergeant, guided by experience and responsibility, took on the role of guide on this unpredictable journey. A ravenous zombie shadow emerged from the melted snow, and in the next moment, like a sinister robber of death, it deftly climbed onto the private's back. The zombie's cold, desiccated hands clamped down on his shoulders, and its rotten jaw rested against the man's neck. Kim Chanu felt the zombie's icy breath on his neck, and the ravenous, dried-up fingers seemed like iron slates digging into his flesh. His voice was drowned in the icy silence, and meanwhile the zombie continued its inhuman attack like a sinister rider on its living prey. A ravenous zombie, with dark eyes devoid of human life, sank its rotten teeth into the private's tender neck. The eerie crunch and wet sound proved to be like a symphony of horror. The zombie's lips touched Kim Chanu's skin like the chilling touch of death. The private's scream, parroting the sergeant's call, pierced the air, filling it with horror and painful reality. Blood began to pulsate from the wound, creating a ghastly picture of the mingling of living body heat and zombie cold. The black-haired boy, caught in a stupor, watched the horrifying scene as if time stood still in his own agony. His eyes reflected a mixture of pain, shock, and powerless despair as he witnessed the zombie gnawing into his mate's neck. At that moment, everything around him blended into a mess of terror, and the sounds of screaming and gnashing of zombie teeth stretched into the impenetrable darkness. The sergeant drew his weapon with trembling hands, his fingers lost in the contours of the grip, as if trying to hold reality in this nightmare. His gaze reflected unbearable shock and determination, in spite of his trembling limbs. The rifle in the sergeant's hands was his last stand in this world of menace and chaos. The ominous light of the barrel emphasized his anxiety, and the shaking of the weapon was a reminder of how events were beyond his control. The private, pinned against a snowdrift by the zombie's rampage, and feeling himself lose control of his body, looked desperately at the sergeant. Words, scraps of pleading, burst from his strained lips. He asked his commanding officer to shoot him. Kim Chanu's eyes reflected not only horror and pain, but also a plea for leniency in the face of inevitability. The private, practically lost behind the crowd of thirsty zombies, screamed at the full power of his lungs for the sergeant to fire as quickly as possible. There was a desperate plea in his voice, piercing through the sounds of the zombies and the portents of a near threat. The shadow of distress distorted the figure of the guy in the crowd, but his voice stood above the noise, expressing not only fear of the zombies, but a plea to be saved from the inevitable. The sergeant, with eyes filled with tears, aimed at the private, apologizing in a soft whisper. His hands shook with the gravity of the moment, but determination gleamed in his eyes. With a heavy heart and accompanied by the last words of apology, the sergeant pulled the trigger of his rifle. The shot ripped through the air, ending the private's suffering, and in that moment, as a shadow of sadness enveloped the man's face, he realized the merciless reality of having to make such tragic decisions. Several bullets fired from his rifle pierced the air and went straight for the private's face, which was already barely visible behind the rotting arms of the zombie. The moment of time freezing created an exquisite but grim picture, where the deadly projectiles carried the heavy, sad choice of the sergeant. The private's face, barely piercing through the shroud of darkness, seemed to remain for a moment in the last act of consciousness. Some metal thing fell sharply onto the pile of zombies around Kim Chanu. The sound of the impact ripped the air, creating momentary confusion among the reanimated dead. The metallic rumble resembled an ominous drumbeat, casting a shadow of uncertainty on their distorted faces. Terrified, the sergeant dashed ahead of the crowd of zombies, his heart pounding furiously as his legs carried him forward on instinct for self-preservation. The shadows of death followed him, and the hoarse sounds of zombie breathing filled the air, providing a grim accompaniment to his flight. The sergeant, face contorted with horror, felt the weight of responsibility for his team and fought for every breath in this running succession of nightmare. The sergeant, exhausted and hopeless, crawled up the mountain on all fours, his hands clawing at the snow and his knees growing painfully cold. A tree loomed before him, already familiar from previous events, like an ominous symbol of his own servitude. Every movement was an ordeal, and the horizon, which had seemed boundless at the beginning, now looked mercilessly unattainable. The man, exhausted and drained of strength, clung to the root of the tree as if it were the last foothold in a vast ocean of distress. His fingers clung to every jagged root, all his will directed at climbing faster to safety. Dark traces of dirt and blood remained on the route, reflecting not only the strength of the sergeant's climb, but also his resilience in the face of the zombie apocalypse. The sergeant finally managed to climb to the top of the mountain, his exhalation heavy and his heart pounding like a drum in a sinister ritual. Behind him, like dead parasites, the paralyzed bodies of zombies formed a grim picture of hopelessness. Their mutilated figures remained motionless, but in their dead eyes read hatred, like the piercing stare of death. The sergeant, sitting on the top, looked down at this grim carnival of zombies, his eyes reflecting a spectrum of emotions: fatigue, fear, but also triumph in the face of imminent danger. The sergeant, sitting on top of the mountain, full of mixed feelings, did not understand how he could have allowed the death of his comrade. The man's thoughts swirled with moments of the past, memories of battles and laughter together, and now those memories seemed like shadows in his soul. Bewilderment and bitterness filled the sergeant's heart as he relived the moments when he could have prevented the horror but lost his partner. The sergeant, sitting on top of the mountain, blamed himself for his lack of vigilance. Each moment of immersion in the memory of the zombies taking his comrade was like a heavy hammer to his own soul. His inner world swirled with questions ranging from "why?" to "what could I have done differently?" The sergeant loaded himself with guilt for that moment of inadequate vigilance in which his strength had failed him, and when every second seemed like an endless slip. The sergeant, sitting on the top of the mountain, tried to catch his breath, his lungs filling with cold air and his heart pounding as if it were trying to escape the clutches of terror. Behind the man could see the footprints left by his own haste and desperate escape from the zombies. These footprints, as a reflection of his own decisions and mistakes, were a painful reminder of the price one pays for survival. Jong Yong-hoon, sitting on the cold snow, clenched his fist as if trying to focus all of his scattered riot of feelings. His eyes read determination as he ordered himself to gather his thoughts. The winter wind whipped his face, but at this moment, the inner fire of his determination burned all the brighter. The sergeant, despite the shadow of loss and self-recrimination, summoned within himself the strength to transcend the storm of emotion. At once the sergeant, gathering his wits, sprang from the top of the mountain and ran forward. His movements were determined, as if each step was a challenge to the forces that were trying to extinguish the light in his soul. Amidst the icy wind and the traces of the past, the man covered the distance, carrying the fire of determination within him. The sergeant sped up, running faster and faster, as if each successive step was a way forward, away from the place where the shadow of death was breathing down his neck. His eyes reflected the inner fire of determination, and his legs carried him like wings through the freezing wind and snowy expanse. The sounds of his desperate running merged with the howling wind to create a symphony of salvation. Each moment became the main goal, faster, further, away from the threats and shadows that sought to claw at his soul. Many years later, the sergeant was once again walking through the snowy forest, but this time he was alone. The traces of time were reflected in his face, in the wrinkles that reminded him of the battle he had fought to survive. In his eyes was a glow of mixed memories, of heavy loss and indomitable determination. The sergeant's steps were slow but sure, as if he carried the experience of every kilometer he had walked. The sergeant stood with his rifle in the snow-covered ruins of a city somewhere in Seoul. The winds of winter's chill wrapped around him like a fragile string in this gloom. Abandoned buildings covered in a layer of snow testified to the imprint time had left on this place. The remains of one of the skyscrapers peeked out from under the snow, like hidden artifacts of an old world frozen in the vortex of time. The glass facades and tall, reinforced concrete structures looked like phantoms of former glory left in this cold captivity. Standing in the snow, the sergeant looked at the ruins where once proud structures had risen to the heavens. In the dilapidated building, the couple sat in old chairs in the kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of former life. Candles, held in jars and old lanterns, cast a warm glow, illuminating the wreckage of what had once been their home. They looked at each other, their gazes like candlelight, reflecting the full range of hardships they had experienced. Opposite, at the kitchen worktop, stood a man. The husband, sitting in his chair, began to unfold his story, as if opening the dusty pages of his past. As he recounted how they had managed to survive, it was as if he were weaving parts of his fate into this complex outdoor world. He said with a note of sadness in his voice that the couple had survived by chance. The man in the ear flap recalled moments of unexpected rescues, when life hung in the balance and fate was thrown into the whirlwind of the apocalypse. The husband, still sitting in the chair, continued his story, recalling the brighter days that had once been part of their lives. "We had an apiary on Mount Chirisan," he began, as if weaving the scent of honey and summer wind into the story. "On that evil day when the apocalypse struck the world, the couple decided to go out to gather honey. In their apiary, in a world where bees buzzed and the scent of blooming flowers saturated the air, they found refuge and peace. In my husband's memories of the apiary on Mount Chirisen, the image of bees going wild came to life. The queen bee, as if ignited by an inner fire, decisively directed her swarm. The bees, normally industrious and quiet, became a living storm, as if they had decided to protest against nature itself. The air was filled with the buzzing of wings and sharp buzzing, and the bees burst out of the hive like a swarm of frantic arrows. The frantic bees, consumed by aggression and chaos, became a living manifestation of the struggle for survival. In their frantic attack on each other, wings buzzed in restless glee, and hives that had recently seemed like cozy homes became the scene of a bloody clash. The bees, usually a symbol of industriousness and order, were now an uncontrollable mass, pouncing on each other with ruthless fury. The couple who had gathered to collect honey watched this strange and ominous turn of events closely. At first, they stopped, startled by the unexpected sight. Climbing Mount Chirisen, they had expected to see a peaceful spot in the verdure of nature, but instead they witnessed a mad scramble of bees. As they exchanged glances, the couple realized that something in the world was broken. Suddenly, the sky, which had previously been clear and open, began to be covered with black clouds, as if the will of nature itself was expressing its displeasure. The dark clouds, thickening over Mount Chirisen, seemed to bring with them news of the coming of something unimaginable. The sounds of humming and the restless wings of bees mingled with the rumble of thunder, filling the air with a vague fear. Huge stones, mysterious and unknown, began to fall from the heavens covered with dark clouds. At first, it looked like a rain of stone shards, slowly and inevitably falling from the sky, smashing everything in their path. These mysterious stones were something completely unlike anything the human eye had ever seen. The man who had lived through such a nightmare was sure that their mysterious guest must have heard this strange explosive symphony too. Then, with bewilderment and wariness, he looked at his wife, sharing with her the sense of uneasiness caused by these mysterious stones that lay on the ground like lightning bolts from the heavens. The husband felt not only the power of nature, but also some unknown connection to what was happening around him. The couple, surrounded by a whirlwind of indescribable events, took refuge in the dugout, while Mount Chirisen seemed to shake with internal upheaval. As if in response to the raging storm, they hastily made their way to a dark corner of their shelter, where their anxious glances were carried to the entrance, which was closed by a primitive door. As the terrible events unfolded around him, my husband, feeling an inner awe, compared this indescribable event to a giant who, as if playing with dolls, shook the peaceful refuge. In his imagination, Mount Chirisen, normally an integral part of the landscape, became an unknown entity, manipulating time and space like a giant carrying the world of lesser mortals in his hands. As he recalled that moment, the husband sadly recalled how he and his wife, gripped by fear and despair, had appealed to all the gods they could remember. In that moment of hopelessness, as Mount Chirisen trembled with mysterious phenomena, their pleas were a mixture of screams, whispers, and inarticulate words. They prayed for a quicker end to all this, for the misfortune that was befalling their secluded corner to go away as suddenly as it had appeared. The husband, completing his exciting narration of that terrible day in the mountains, noticed that their mysterious guest was silently listening to every word, as if he was entering the atmosphere of what was happening. After the last breath of the man in the Ushanka, filled with memories of those terrible events, the visitor slowly turned to them with 2 cups of coffee in his hands. The white vapor rising from the cups created around him the atmosphere of the incredible world they were in. The spouses, clutching 2 mugs of fragrant coffee in their hands with astonishment, exchanged glances with a sense of the unbelievable. They felt the weight of each cup, as if their hands carried not only the aroma of coffee, but also some mysterious energy. Each mug seemed like something special, as if not only coffee beans, but also stories, destinies, and memories were stored inside them. The man in the waistcoat, staring into the void, as if gazing into a distant memory, slowly said that if a man had the will to live, he would always find a way to survive. In his words sounded not only confidence, but also a certain philosophical wisdom. He seemed to deeply understand that the power of inner striving can be a reliable guide through the darkest of times. The guest revealed a map of his activities, saying that survivors in Seoul often exchange resources and items. In his words came a story of mutual aid and rebuilding. Apparently, the man was not just an observer in this process, but an active participant. He added that his own contribution to the common cause was that he created various items for sale, mostly food. The guest described his work with loving attention to detail. Cooking, packaging, presenting the products. All this became a kind of survival art for him. The woman looked at her husband with eyes full of respect and confidence, and said that they had made the right choice in reaching Seoul. She spoke with deep confidence, as if the city had become an oasis for them in a world of change and uncertainty. They found in Seoul not only safety, but also a community of like-minded people where everyone contributed to the common cause of survival. The wife, listening attentively to the mysterious man's story, expressed her surprise. The woman's eyes lit up with interest, and she said, smiling slightly, that she was surprised to learn that someone was creating things for sale under such conditions. The spouse was curious about what exactly the man did and how he found the resources he needed. She was interested in learning more about how the man was able to maintain not only survivability, but also a creative spirit in a world saturated with the challenges of survival. The mysterious man looked at his wife with a smile, as if he possessed a secret he was willing to share. The guest said that even in this lost world, people must find different ways to survive. Therefore, he creates things that can be useful to other survivors. It's not only a way to do something useful, but also to keep them connected and sharing in this new world where every day is another victory. The man's words sounded like a message of hope in dark times. The spouse, imbued with the idea of sharing and creativity in this new world, smiled back. She said it's so important to keep not only the urge to survive, but also a piece of humanity. Women create something with their hands too, and she believes your items can be an addition to our daily living. Perhaps she and her guest could trade something? Her voice sounded like a friendly suggestion, full of hope for the restoration of ordinary life through little notes of creativity. The woman, in gratitude for the coffee, offered her help to the guest. Her husband intervened, considering such words unseemly, given that it was their first meeting. The husband suggested the idea that the man in the waistcoat might have business secrets of his own. The woman replied to the guest that he was behaving in a friendly manner in their company, so she blurted this out. The man smiled oddly, noting that he liked energetic people like this couple. The man in the ushanka did not understand what it was said, and looked questioningly at the newcomer. The husband said that he had probably seen his guest somewhere, for the man's smile seemed familiar to him. The wanderer opened the doors of the wardrobe, which made a distinctive creaking sound. The gray-haired man took some torches out of the cupboard and turned to his companion, saying that he often hears this kind of thing, that he looks like an uncle of something, then he looks like a younger cousin. The guest's grimace did look sinister. The man in the waistcoat said that he himself was aware of how much he looked like a petty proprietor. The mysterious geezer was tapping a torch against his palm, while saying that he wanted to show the couple his business, and that the couple would need to explore the local market since they were going to settle here. Holding 2 light sources in his hands, he told me that he was in the business of making somewhat unusual things. Whatever it meant, it sounded strange and even a little frightening. The man in the ushanka hat rose to his feet, surprised by the occupation of his new acquaintance, to which the latter offered to follow him. The odd man said he would make an exception for the couple, saying that the wife of the male runaway could rest for the time being, and he would appreciate it if the wife would wash the dishes behind her. The latter heard the man in the waistcoat and told them to come back soon. The 2 men found themselves on some stairs, and around them there was nothing but darkness and grey stripped walls. It was obvious that this building had been badly damaged by the terrible upheavals of the apocalypse, and the imprints of the past remained in the form of fading paint. The dead silence was interrupted by the soft click of a torch, and suddenly there was at least a ray of light in this dark and frightening environment. The men were about to descend into a certain corridor when the gray-haired traveler interrupted the awkward silence. He said that he doubted the wisdom of his actions, and that perhaps he shouldn't have brought the fugitive in the ear flap. He, in turn, replied that it was very important for him to find out what the stranger was doing, and that the man would repay him for such invaluable information. A man with a beard that testified to his long and drawn-out stay in this endless hell of the apocalypse ran his hand along the wall, as if brushing away the dust of the past that kept the light from shining through. The fugitive said that judging by this location shown to him by the strange man, he was certain that the weirdo was doing something interesting and unusual. There seemed to be no hint of fear on his face, only childlike curiosity and hope for a normal, though by the standards of the zombie world, life. The man in the ear flap noticed traces of blood on the wallpaper, or rather remnants of it. It seems that logical thoughts began to come into his head about what this strange merchant was doing, so that this information was kept in the strictest secrecy. But, calming himself with thoughts of a new future for his family, he must have switched off his critical thinking and moved on. The pair finally reached the place they wanted. The room was covered in the same peeling wallpaper. There were some shelves around, and the room itself was brightened with a red color. The man was stunned by the unusual room, expressing amazement at the strange interior. It seemed that at this moment his instinct for self-preservation was not working at all. The fugitive focused his gaze on something in front of him, not realizing if he was dreaming or if it really existed. It was unclear at that moment what emotions his eyes were expressing. It turned out that this miracle was pigs, probably rare creatures in the apocalyptic world. The man was surprised by such a find and asked the traveler why he needed pigs, to which the latter replied that they were material. There were mountains of tinned pigs on one of the racks. To be more precise, the rack was completely covered with them, and the walls behind this peculiar table were all stained with blood. Such a picture could not help but surprise the man in the ushanka hat, while his cheerful guest smiled happily, proud of his achievement. The eyes of the frightened fugitive opened wide, and he stood there, dripping with sweat. Realizing that the mysterious visitor was killing the poor animals with his own hands, he didn't know how to react, or if he should react at all. The shocked man's eyes began to blur, and the mere sight of the food made him want to cry or vomit. In the atmosphere of the underground meat factory, where everything looked like a cheap horror film, such an activity seemed even more horrible. But what was more frightening was the satisfied look of the gray-haired newcomer, who was showing how much he enjoyed his work. But as scary and strange as it all looked, the pork snacks were to the hungry man's liking. It was a long time to live in an almost empty world, populated only by zombies and survivors. The appearance of the meat grinder was both frightening and tantalizing, like forbidden fruit. The smell of meat overrode all desire to escape from this dungeon, and all the hungry man's thoughts were focused only on a delicious meal. The new acquaintance told the fugitive that these tins were not simple. They were made of selected meat, which the man had never eaten, even in the most peaceful times. This attitude further stimulated the hungry man's desire to savor at least a piece of meat delight. The man in the ear flap started talking enthusiastically about how he hadn't eaten tinned food for decades, showing with all his appearance how much he treasured such a valuable find. While the poor man was slowly approaching the jars with delicacies, the strange man stepped back, taking off his waistcoat. Wearing gloves as black as the darkness around them, the wanderer complained that the bloodthirsty walking dead hadn't been tasting fresh flesh lately. On one of the racks in front of the mysterious guest was a whole set of various knives, saws, scalpels, and other cutting and stabbing implements. A small hammer and some pliers could also be seen there. It would seem that all one had to do was turn round and run away. But the hungry man, tempted by meat snacks, paid no attention to it. The man in the ushanka could not but agree with his comrade, saying that he and his wife tried to eat captured beasts to at least somehow live in this nightmare world. But for the most part, such prey was rotten from the inside. The poor fugitive was already shaking with his own thoughts, looking at the pigs that looked so clean and well-fed, as if it were all just a fantasy of a man gone mad. The frantic and hungry eyes of the man in the ushanka seemed to be drilling the canned goods with their gaze, and suddenly, undeterred by his desires, the fugitive asked the mysterious maniac for one favor. The man was begging to take at least one jar or even one spoonful of this treat for himself and his wife. Sweat dripped down his face and he looked like a mad zombie, dreaming only of food. No sooner had he finished than the man's monologue was interrupted by a wanderer standing with a hammer behind the poor fugitive. The man in an ushanka hat turned round slowly, feeling the maniac's heavy gaze on him. The mad wanderer looked at his victim with mad eyes, his gaze visible even in the darkness of the room. He said with that expression that the man really had no shame or conscience. The fugitive obviously did not realize what was happening. His eyes were full of surprise and fear. He turned round and asked the maniac what he had said. Drops of sweat ran down the man's face, who did not know what to expect from such a friend. The man in the white apron clutched the hammer tighter and tighter as he came closer and closer to the poor fugitive. He repeated that the poor man had no conscience, to which the latter asked him to stop and not to do anything stupid. The poor fellow began to back away from the maniac, but he seemed to have no chance. The man in the hat asked why the strange visitor needed all these paraphernalia, realizing what might happen now. The mysterious weirdo smiled wryly, saying that he couldn't have made that much tinned food from a couple of precious pigs. His speech was already suggestive. The man with the hammer shared his secret, saying that he only adds 20% pork to his snacks. One was left to guess what the other 80 were. The caped fugitive moved further and further away, and the group of pigs stood around him. The shadow of the maniacal butcher reflected ominously on the blood-drenched tiles. It all looked like some kind of horror film. The bearded man guessed what the canned food was actually made of, realizing how today would actually end. He certainly didn't want to die. The ominous silence was interrupted by a rumbling sound, as if the maniac's victim had hit something huge. The man, already frightened out of his wits, turned round when he heard such a thud and saw a horrible sight that surprised him even more. Behind the fugitive, dozens, if not hundreds, of corpses of apocalyptic survivors hung on iron chains stained with blood. Some were missing a leg, some were missing an arm, and some had only one head left. It was certainly not a pleasant sight. What to say about the condition of the poor man who had become another victim of an inhuman maniac? The poor man stood in a stupor, sweating, because he realized that he would never get out of here alive. A mate, who until recently had wanted to help the survivors, was staring him in the face. The man in the hat had no time to speak before he was hit in the head with a hammer. A fountain of blood covered everything around him, as if an artist had spilled his colors on a canvas. The crowd of pigs immediately squealed, either sympathizing with the poor man or sensing his imminent doom. Their almost demonic shrieks turned everything that was happening into an absurdity, as if it were all an illusion of a mentally ill man. The bloody butcher exhaled loudly after the deed was done, satisfied with the result. The man had a wide grin on his face, and his very face was smeared in blood splatters. Then, the maniac looked like one of the horsemen of the apocalypse, ironically. The man in the ear flap seemed to recognize his tormentor, calling him by name, Ju Young Ak. The exhausted fugitive was lying on the tiles, bleeding. It seems that this was the fate of his fate. The maniac called the poor man a scoundrel and scoffed that he still remembered him. The man in the hat lay surrounded by a dozen pigs who were looking at his bleeding body with animal interest. Red marks stained the floor beneath his feet, but no one cared. The madman turned around and called out to some mistress, as if someone was watching the whole thing like a theater. Without waiting for a response, the madman called out to the mystery woman once more to come out to him. His crooked grimace looked like an animal grin or clown makeup, adding to his already disgusting appearance. The mistress finally responded to being addressed and said she would be right out. Darkness closed almost everything from human eyes, only occasionally exposing the bloody situation around. I wish it were all a dream. But alas and ah, only a married man who came to Seoul, eager to live out his years in peace with his beloved spouse, became a dish for some ghastly cannibals. A stream of blood spread across the cold floor, filling even the smallest crevices. Such a red carpet looked like a path to hell. Although more like a way out of it, since hell was already in this horrible room. A strange crunching sound was heard from somewhere, as if someone was eating someone's bones. The table with the tinned food didn't look as appetizing as it used to, although even then the atmosphere of the bloody walls didn't give the feeling of tasty food. Now fully knowing the composition of meat products, looking at those tin boxes was disgusting, even nauseating. The red liquid dripped directly into the bucket, though it was no use. The room was covered in the bloody marks of death anyway. The man in the apron was musing as he prepared his meat dishes. The maniac's black shoes were completely soaked in blood, but apparently he didn't care. He talked to himself about the fact that there were a lot of stupid people trying so hard to get into Seoul. Now his actions looked like one of the solutions to the migration issue, even though it was now the zombie apocalypse. But on the other hand, it was easier for the Mad Butcher to manage the farm. But cutting each other up while there's almost no one left in the world, but the undead, is not a good idea. The gray-haired man smiled satisfactorily, asking some woman why she was looking at him so strangely. It was not clear who was looking at him more inadequately, him or the woman. The maniac's eyes were full of joy and madness as he looked directly into the dead girl's eyes, asking her if the woman was offended that the madman had hung her next to the corpses of pigs. This rhetorical question added more absurdity to the situation. The madman mocked the corpse of the woman, saying that she was no different from a pig, for her body was just as mutilated and shapeless. The iron bars and chains only added to the nightmare, as if the girl's life was worthless. Smiling, the madman began to list all the similarities between man and pig. They both had fillers, anvils, and fat. The butcher seemed proud of his knowledge as he looked at the woman's body, bloody and scratched. The man opened his eyes wide with his fingers, saying that a woman has the same number of eyes as a pig. It was as if he was justifying his actions, not realizing the immorality of his actions. Although, being a cannibal butcher, it must be normal for a man to do so. The maniac picked himself up by his ears, revealing that man and animal had 2 of each. The blood left on his gloves gave him a clownish makeup as he touched his eyes. It was a frightening sight to watch, but since there was no one else in the room but pigs and breathless bodies, no one cared. The gray-haired man stretched his bloody hands towards the girl's corpse, and his face looked like the mask of some killer clown. Like the Joker, he grinned widely, smeared with the blood of his victims. The maniac's apron turned from white to maroon, and he compared the blood of a pig and a woman, saying it was the same scarlet. The butcher's bloody scenes were interrupted by a noise coming from the other room. It would seem that nothing should interfere with such a man's occupation, but work is work. Apparently, he had received a call from a customer about some tinned goods. It was a pity they didn't know what was really in such snacks. The fact that someone had interrupted the maniac's game with corpses made him angry, forcing him to go upstairs to another room. The gray-haired man ironically said that someone had installed cameras at his desk and was watching him, keeping the butcher at bay. After all, as soon as the meat comes to his lair, everyone calls him. Ju went into another room, also quite grey and creepy, but better lit. There were pipes and chains all around, and a radio was placed on one of the tanks. It vibrated constantly, which annoyed Yonak even more. The blood-smeared man picked up the phone from the customer, saying that the butcher shop, as he called it, was on the phone. Apparently, the customer and the maniac had already had some dialogue, for someone on the other side of the receiver said they had already talked about some kind of car. It had a V6 type battery, a manganese battery, and so 12 pieces were purchased. A smile immediately ran across Ju's face as he contentedly asked the customer when the cars would arrive at his place. This is how human lives are easily exchanged for material things, even in the face of an apocalypse that was supposed to unite everyone to defeat evil. Some man on the other side said that the goods for the exchange were hard to get this time, so he offered the butcher to take the cars for 30 tins. The smile immediately disappeared from the gray-haired maniac's face, replaced by a surprised grimace, and the man himself said that 30 pieces was robbery. The interlocutor tried to clarify the situation by saying that it was Kim Pilson's boss's birthday in a couple of nights, so the order from above was to make sure to prepare something valuable as a present, no matter what it cost. The bloodied madman clutched the walkie-talkie in his hands, filling the room with anger that emanated from him in incredible amounts. The veins were showing on the man's forehead, and he was shouting into the receiver that the calendar had disappeared many years ago. So what birthday could we talk about? The carver's eyes, full of rage, were like the aggressive gaze of a predator ready to tear its prey apart. Suddenly, the gray-haired geezer turned back sharply, as if he had been jerked away by some unknown force. His gaze was so heavy that it seemed to burn through the ceiling. It was evident that the madman was not satisfied with this state of affairs. The man looked around. There was no one around. Only the light bulb on the ceiling flickered like a star about to burn out. It looked like a mental hospital, except that the orderly had a bloody apron instead of a white coat. Looking directly at the flickering lamp, The gray-haired butcher seemed to order her to calm down with his horrifying gaze. It is frightening to imagine the emotions of the victims, whose last moment of life was such a mocking gaze from an inadequate killer. Turning back to the radio, the angry man began to set his terms. Either 20 tins or nothing. His matting could be heard, probably in the whole neighborhood. The butcher clenched his fist angrily, as if in his hand was the throat of whoever was talking to him. Still, whispering among themselves, the customers decided to agree to the terms and asked who they would bring in for delivery. The madman smiled widely, just as he had when the man in the ear flap had agreed to come down to his basement. The maniac began to remember the names of the newcomers Mijin and Yunju, and once he remembered, they were the ones who were immediately asked to come. It's scary to imagine what plans the man had for those two. The disgruntled customers said they had enough to do, and they weren't going to send 2 people each. The gray-haired man stared at the radio in shock, realizing that his plans were going down the drain. The customers, without knowing it, may have saved someone's life. The client said they would send only 1 courier, which certainly did not please the maniac. His hopes for a new victim were dashed, and he was upset by the news. The man in the apron began to complain into the walkie-talkie that his interlocutors were happy to eat the tinned food he had prepared, but did not want to help with its production. The only pity was that they did not understand what this madman was talking about. The bloodthirsty killer rubbed his face with his hand and said that his customers were making gentlemen of themselves. It seemed to be some cheap manipulation to keep power over them. After a moment's thought, the butcher opened his eyes wide, as if seeing his interlocutors before him. His pupils were narrower and narrower, and he was full of anger at his naughty partners. The enraged gray-haired man began shouting loudly and swearing, threatening that he would come to Kim Pilsen and bring order to the hierarchy. The butcher's face was so mangled with anger that he didn't look like himself. The veins in his face were swollen and looked as if they were about to burst from the strain. The clownish makeup of blood added even more horror to the image of the serial killer. The man bent over as if in death agony with a heart-wrenching scream that permeated the space around him. He turned to insults, calling his clients complete wretches, and said he could come and give them a chance. The inadequate murderer was shouting, drooling profusely from his mouth. Ju threatened that he would come and divide everyone into humans and cattle again, whatever that meant, because maybe that will put your brains back in place. Yonak also said that if you want to live like a human being, you have to listen to what he tells you. From the last of his strength, the gray-haired man shouted that the shameless youth was talking to him. His gaze was as angry as ever, and his hands were ready to break the radio, clutching it tighter and tighter. It seemed as if it would never end. After a long and agonizing talk, Yonak slowly stepped back from the barrel that held the Apocalypse communication device and tried to catch his breath. The flood of uncontrollable emotions had exhausted him, and the man clenched his fists as hard as he could and tried to come to his senses. Leaning against the barrel, the maniac lifted his head up, inhaled and exhaled deeply, releasing his tension. Closing his eyes, he imagined how he would deal with his disobedient customers. His hands gripped the metal on which the man leaned tighter and tighter. The bloody clown took the walkie-talkie in his hand and said, "End of message." But for those people who spoke to the butcher, it was not just a sentence, but something else, like an order or a sentence. After such infernal screaming into the tube, it was scary to comment on the situation at all. Some whispering came from the speakers again. The customers were quietly negotiating what to say to the angry gray-haired man. In the end, one of them said, stammering, that they would send 2 couriers tomorrow before noon, as Yonak had wanted. Still, the boys were frightened by the maniac's animalistic roar and changed their minds. After hearing the message to the end, the man switched off the machine, commenting angrily that he had to babysit these youngsters all the time. He was shocked that the customers dared to tell him what to do. Apparently, Zhu and his interlocutors had met before, and perhaps the former was higher in rank. Relaxed, the gray-haired man scratched his forehead and said to himself that he would have to visit these guys again and do the knife dance so that they would finally realize who was in charge. It remained to be seen what would happen at their meeting. The bloody butcher decided to turn his thoughts elsewhere and think only of good things today. A wry smile appeared on his face as he thought of the couriers that would be stopping by tomorrow. He repeated their surnames, as if dainty with every sound he uttered, anticipating a new batch of tinned human meat. The man in the apron looked like the eyes of a dead man, and the bloody makeup only added to the horror of the image. His plan for tonight was to go to bed early. For tomorrow, he needed to be fully relieved for a productive day at work. The room Yonak was in was a dingy grey color, and the interior could barely be called loft. The wallpaper was tattered everywhere, revealing the bare brick walls, and instead of decorations, there was a pile of pallets and boxes. It was still snowing outside the window, which made the dreary conditions even more lifeless. At that time, on the other side of the building, someone was looking at the skyscraper through a monocle. The dilapidated building, which looked like a modernized Leaning Tower of Pisa, made one wonder how anyone could live there, because it was not safe. But nevertheless, the survivors had no choice, and even such a dangerous shelter pleased them, because it was their palace, saving them from the dog's cold and packs of rebellious dead. The watcher kept changing angles, apparently scrutinizing in detail what stood before him. Perhaps it was another survivor who wanted to reach out to others like him, though a monocle in his possession was a rarity for ordinary people. Still, he had somehow made it through the snow and cold, finding this shelter amongst thousands of ruins. This stalker turned out to be Sergeant Jong Young-hoon, who was already familiar to us. Apparently, he had reached his destination and was looking to see if it was the same building. It's just a pity that the sergeant can't share his emotions with his dead partner, with whom they wanted to reach the capital together. The man was lying between snowdrifts, apparently for his own safety. He was wearing the same clothes, a jacket with fur, a huge rucksack with equipment, and winter goggles on a strap. So much time seemed to have passed, but for the sergeant it was as if it had stopped, so much so that his appearance hadn't changed. Even his haircut was the same. After a few dozen minutes of observation, the sergeant finally realized that he had reached Seoul. His blue eyes opened so wide with wonder that it was as if he had seen the coming of Christ. Young-hoon exhaled in relief and joy at the same time, already imagining how he would meet the survivors after so many years of wandering. The sergeant wondered what kind of people lived in the mysterious building he was looking at. Chon crawled through the snow towards it as the snow and cold wind tried to stop him. The atmosphere, though, looked frightening, but the sergeant who had lived in such conditions for more than a year didn't care about such things anymore. He was moving, or rather crawling, towards his goal, no matter what. The man lay down to rest for a while, wondering what the owner of the skyscraper would be like. Hoping that the man would be nice and tell him a lot about his apocalyptic life, the sergeant anticipated that he would learn a lot about the people and the situation in the city. Apparently, he needed it for some important mission. Perhaps he wanted to unravel the mystery of all the events that had taken place in the world. The man raised his eyebrows slightly and carefully adjusted his glasses, as if trying to see every detail. With a thoughtful look, he said he intended to spend a couple more days watching the mysterious building to make sure it was safe. The sergeant intended to visit the owner of the building, if it was a safe place to visit. He seized every opportunity to talk to the locals, to learn about the modern world, and a society he hadn't been to in years. After sitting on the mountain of snow for a couple more minutes, and seeing the entire area in front of him in as much detail as possible, the sergeant decided to drive down the snowdrift. With an abrupt movement, as if he were on a lift, he went down. The man's figure cut through the snow around him like a samurai's sword slashing his victims. Quietly descending to the ground, the man sat leaning against the mountain with his weapon. Apparently, he wasn't sure whether he should go into the den or not. In front of the sergeant lay the load he had dropped before he drove off the mountain. It was evident that he was not sure of the safety of this building. The snow crunched under the sergeant's feet as he got to his feet. He deftly picked up the weight on the ground and slung it behind his back. The snow was still falling from the sky, adding to the mystery of the moment. The man's glasses were sweating profusely, almost completely covering his face. The man, picking his way carefully, made his way towards the dilapidated building. His steps were sure and steady, each footstep leading through the rubble, as if the sergeant were reading the story of destruction in every stone in his path. The man stepped into the building, where instead of a door, a passage opened into a world of forgotten corridors and flickering light, as if inviting him to explore the inner mysteries of the abandoned structure. The snow beneath the sergeant's feet still continued to crunch, as if it were the man's guide to the world of apocalyptic ruins. The sergeant, immersed in semi-darkness, pressed the torch button with determination. A sudden beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the contours of the surrounding space, and the dim light spread mysterious shadows across the walls of the abandoned building. Yong-hoon explored these catacombs as if they were an ancient structure of some extinct civilization. The man strode through the corridors, pulling the sled tied behind him. The sound of sliding structures on the floor accompanied his steps, creating a peculiar rhythm in the abandoned space. The sergeant's figure, standing out against the gloom, resembled a strange combination of explorer and traveler, leaving a mysterious trail behind him. The man entered the room and was surprised to find many huge windows letting light inside. They created a majestic vision, revealing the landscape beyond the walls and transforming the room into a bright and open place inside the abandoned complex. The sergeant warned himself that the light he was creating could be seen through the windows, which could lead to possible danger. Yong-hoon's words rang with serious concern about maintaining invisibility in this abandoned space. A man, looking at a picture of people on one of the plaques, said that he was more frightened by living people because they had intelligence, not like zombies. The man said that he was more frightened of living people because they were intelligent, not zombies. The sergeant noticed a washroom sign with a silhouette of a man, his eye caught by the unassuming figure depicted. With a slight smile, the man realized that even in an abandoned place, some details remained incredibly ordinary, and yet, once upon a time, people had lived here. Yong-hoon turned to the plaque with a mocking gaze, as if questioning himself about the rightness of the path he had chosen. It seemed as if there was no justice left in this world, and everyone was eager to kill each other. The man chuckled, noting that there was no more secluded corner in the abandoned place than the toilet. The sergeant's laugh sounded ironic, emphasizing the unexpected paradox in the search for safety. The light from his torch was painting a rainbow on the wall, which at least added some color to this gray, rotten world. The man directed the light upwards into the washroom, which was at an incline, as if wanting to shed light on the mysterious corners of this unusual room. The beam of light spread across the walls, creating a play of shadows in this strange space. The ruined tiles and broken mirror hinted that there had once been life here. The sergeant, faced with the need to free his hands, resolutely bit down on the torch with his teeth. Every rustle was audible in the empty room, so even a sound as quiet as teeth clattering against plastic could be a signal for zombies or humans. Still, the man was ready for new challenges in the dark abode of the abandoned place. Yong-hoon grasped the threshold of the room with determination, his fingers tight around the edge as he began to climb upwards, aiming to overcome the obstacle and reach the upper level of the building. The man cautiously began to climb into the toilet room, bending down and traversing the narrow opening. His movements were cautious as he carefully made his way inside, ready to explore the hidden corners of the place. Chon didn't even pay attention to his heavy backpack, for he had the goal of securing himself as quickly as possible in front of him. The man finally made his way inside and settled down on the floor, or rather on the wall, which was sloped like the rest of the building. Concentrating on the contents of the sled, he was actively searching for something important in this desolate space. The only source of light at that moment was Chon's torch, which the sergeant still held in his mouth. The man deftly climbed up the toilet cubicles, each step accompanied by the sounds of creaking doors and rumbling underfoot. With Yong-hoon's dexterity, the stalls became unexpected stepping stones in his journey upwards, creating a sonic symphony in the silence of the abandoned skyscraper. The sergeant, after a long and tedious ascent, finally reached the last stall. With a successful maneuver, he climbed up, sitting steadily on the top, as if completing his fascinating ascent into this mysterious space. The man's wagon remained at the bottom, tied to Chon on a rope. The man perched on top of the stall and began to scrutinize the sloping ceiling. His eyes lit up with curiosity, and his gaze glided over every detail, as if he were trying to unravel the mysteries that had been buried by time in this unusual part of the abandoned structure. The sergeant, sitting on top of the stall, tapped determinedly on the sloping ceiling, listening intently to each sound as if trying to unlock the secrets of the place. The sounds of his tapping met the answer in the flickering shadows from his torch. The man, exploring the ceiling, suddenly noticed a loose tile. His attention was captured by this detail, as if it opened a door to something previously unseen. With determination, Chon decided to explore further, uncovering the possible secrets of this abandoned corner. The sergeant, examining the departing tile, discovered a small crevice. His fingers gingerly explored this narrow passage, as if it were a clue to the hidden places inside the ruined structure. The light from the torch came in through the small opening, illuminating everything behind the tile. The man scrutinized the crevice and then resolutely pushed the tiles aside. A noticeable creak accompanied his movement, and the passage opened up to reveal a new perspective inside the abandoned space. Behind the pulled-back tile was the frame of a building. The sergeant who inspected it stated emphatically that it would be his safe escape route. Apparently, the discovery of the skeleton offered him a new strategy for survival in this evil world, where every wrong decision could cost lives. The blue foot of the zombie stepped out into the snow, creating a contrast with the white cover. Her footsteps left distinctive imprints, like a strange trail in the winter gloom, giving an ominous atmosphere to this abandoned place. The snow crunched under the zombie woman's feet, her footsteps accompanied by the sound of ice crystals shattering under the weight of each step. The woman was dressed in a purple leotard and a pink hat with flowers on it. The sound of crunching added to the ominous atmosphere, creating a moment of tension in the silence of the surrounding winter landscape. The woman steadily made her way through the snowdrifts, continually climbing to the peaks and descending into the lowlands. Her footprints remained clear in the white cover, as if she were making her own history in the winter landscape. The zombie didn't seem to care where it went, as long as it fed on human flesh. The zombie let out a snarl like the roar of a beast. Her cursed cry penetrated the silence like the echo of an ominous awakening in the world, disturbing the tranquility of the surroundings. The woman's face was wrinkled, and frost vapor emanated from her rotten mouth. Her growls were more and more insistent and annoying, sounding like the echo of darkness. The zombie roar grew in volume like a rushing storm, breaking the silence of the environment and filling the space with its ominous sound. It was hard to believe that this had once been a normal person with a life of his own. Suddenly, someone's determined hand severed the woman's head, cutting off the ominous snarl. The air, whistling from someone's sword, was all that could be heard in space. A dark silhouette, like an executor of fate, decisively ended this grim moment, filling the silence with a sudden end to the threat. The severed head flew downwards, tapping against the mountains of snow. Its lifeless features soared slowly and clumsily through the air, creating a strange moment where horror and unreality mingled in a choreography of fallen snow crystals. In the snow, one could see the tracks of some kind of car or sledge that had rushed past the zombies. The head remained lying in the snow, its eyes searching in vain for something around it. Meanwhile, the body, stripped of its threatening part, still stood like a monument to a senseless menace, incapable of further movement. The sudden disharmony created an awkward and unnatural picture in this silent winter landscape. The man sitting on the snowmobile was masterfully steering it, sword in hand. His figure stood out against the white cover, and his gaze was directed forward, full of determination. The man was smiling furiously, as if he had just destroyed every zombie in existence. The snowmobile was rushing across the snowy terrain, and the guy, like a warrior on his ice ship, was ready for a new adventure. Against the white landscape, another snowmobile was approaching the zombie woman, with sticks with dead men's heads on the back of them. This eerie ensemble emphasized the presence of the threat rushing from behind, and created an eerie visual impression in this snowy environment. The driver shouted out enthusiastically and swung forward at the decapitated body of the zombie. His snowmobile cut through the blocks of snow around him. It looked like an ice fountain. The man's enthusiasm was palpable in the air, creating an atmosphere of tension and determination on this icy trail. The driver, waving his sword, approached the zombie woman with confidence. He wielded the weapon with skill. His movements were smooth and decisive, creating the image of a brave defender against this cold landscape. The sharp weapon cut through the air around him, creating a distinctive sound. The sword in the driver's hands cut sharply through the zombie's body, creating a moment where cold steel met undead flesh. The sound of metal meeting flesh resistance broke the silence, and the light bouncing off the blade flickered in this grim scenario, creating an image of a decisive clash during this struggle. The red-haired driver in strange makeup carelessly broke his sword against the dead man's body. The unfortunate moment interrupted his vigorous movements, and half of the sword was sticking out of the zombie's body. But the man apparently hadn't noticed it yet, continuing to drive on, smiling broadly. On the driver's neck dangled wireless headphones, neatly tied on a string. As the man moved, they made a distinctive sound, like some bones in the possession of a shaman. This unusual accessory added contrast to his warlike appearance, creating a mysterious and modern element in this cold and hostile world. The red-haired man suddenly noticed that his sword had broken. At that moment, a second guy on a snowboard tied behind the first guy's snowmobile was following him. The snowboarder was already ready to attack the hostile zombie, intending to ride right up to him. The man in the green jacket grinningly called the zombie woman a sucker, then took a sharp swing and flew directly above her. At that moment, the air was filled with tension, and his unruly movement added a touch of audacity to the scene in the cold and hostile surroundings. The man plowed the zombie woman to the floor with a graceful leap from above. His movement was vigorous and decisive, and as he lunged at her, he demonstrated his masterful wrestling in this cold and hostile environment. The snowboarder, noticing something interesting and frightening, turned to the dead man, his gaze filled with attention and determination, as if he had discovered something strange that shouldn't be there. The man's face changed from pleased and defiant to frightened, and he almost fell off his snowboard. It appeared that the russet-haired guy had stepped on the red-headed driver's splintered sword, sticking out of the zombie's body. His facial expression shifted into a mix of surprise and determination. This unexpected moment brought a new element to the scenario, reminding us that dangers await everywhere, and no one is immune to them. The snowboarder who had flown into the air suddenly cried out in pain as the point of the red-haired man's broken sword struck him. The sound of pain and surprise merged into a single moment, reminding him that even on this cold and dangerous journey, there was a risk of falling victim to unexpected blows of fate. The man in the green jacket drove on, screaming in pain, as traces of blood stained the snow around him. His companions rushed after him, and their figures were woven into this cold, cinematic canvas, where a scream pierced the silence of the winter landscape. A medley of blood and snow-white cover rose up as if an artist had mixed the colors for his new masterpiece. The man with the staples on his slit mouth, who decapitated the zombie, watched the snowboarder's suffering intently and suddenly laughed. His laughter sounded like an outcome of cold humor in this gruesome scenario, creating a grim combination of hilarity and menace in this chilling moment. Behind the wounded guy was also a car, wrapped in chains and adorned with the same sticks with zombie heads hanging from their ends. Its approach created an ominous rumble in this snowy landscape, as if it were a foreshadowing of a new, terrible chapter in this cold and hostile story. The man with piercings driving the car laughed as he watched the snowboarder suffer and called him a cretin. His laughter sounded like a bitter commentary in this cold drama, creating a tense atmosphere in this hostile landscape. It seemed that someone else was in the car, in the back seat. Behind the driver of the car sat two sad-looking girls, a black-haired girl and a russet-haired girl. Their tired looks and disgruntled facial expressions emphasized the gravity of the situation and the lack of joy in this grim adventure. The women's hair was in different directions, and the clothes they wore were torn and dirty. The girls looked down longingly, their gazes piercing the lifeless landscape, as if trying to find something comforting in this cold and gloomy journey. Sadness and hope were intertwined in their eyes, creating a touching moment in this uncertain atmosphere. A squad of these men on snowmobiles were determinedly rushing straight into the abandoned skyscraper, leaving a bloody trail behind them. The winter wind whipped the snow, creating swirls of red dust, their movement resembling a strange dance of death, leading them inside the building, where new secrets and threats could lurk. From one of the drifts near the wheel tracks in the snow came a strange sound, as if something was moving beneath it. The mysterious rustling made it seem as if there were unknown forces lurking beneath the white cover, ready to come to light in this world of snowy mysteries. The sergeant emerged from the snowdrift, shattering the snow cover that until a few minutes ago had sheltered him. The sounds of crackling and rustling snow accompanied his appearance, giving the impression that he was rising from his winter rest, ready for action in this bleak and cold environment. The sergeant, making sure no one was around, crawled a little towards the abandoned building to look around. His movements were cautious, as if he were entering a territory where every rustle could herald a new threat. The man's gaze swept over the surrounding landscape, ready to uncover the secrets of this forgotten place. The sergeant pulled his glasses off his face, his gaze filled with seriousness. He said that here, one might not be able to guess who it was, revealing some mystery in this abandoned place. Yong-hoon's words sounded like a warning that the past of this place might hold dark secrets ready to come out. The sergeant scrutinized the traces of blood in the snow, his expression expressing seriousness and investigative interest. The red patterns standing out against the white background told him the silent story of what had happened here. The answers to the questions were hidden in this cold trail of blood, and the sergeant was ready to reveal their secrets. The man lay down on the snow, and taking off his monocle, began to scrutinize the surrounding terrain. His eye in the monocle recorded every trace and detail, as if he were a detective immersed in carefully analyzing the traces left by the mysterious events in this cold landscape. The sergeant started to say that Seoul was crazy, but before he could finish, he immediately started to deny what he had said. There was a hesitation in his eyes, as if Chon was unsure how much of it was true, not wanting to admit what he had said before. The sergeant said it was not the city's fault, but the deranged survivors. His voice was confident, but with a touch of bitterness, as if he realized that not only the zombies, but also the humans had played a part in the drama unfolding in this forgotten place. Jong Yong-hoon removed the monocle and said that most of the people here were a threat. His voice was resolute and impartial, and his gaze reflected the hardness of a man who was used to seeking the truth in this dangerous, cold world. The man exhaled thoughtfully, as if anticipating something big he had yet to tackle. Looking through the monocle, the sergeant saw a group of men on snowmobiles stop near an abandoned building. The reflection in the monocular lens made their figures stand out in the cold landscape, creating a mysterious and attention-grabbing sight. This moment was a new piece in the complex puzzle that was to be solved. One of the drivers told the other to drive the two girls to him. Their exchange of glances and gestures gave the impression that not only survival was at play here, but also some hidden relationships that could affect the course of events in this cold and dangerous world. The ruined walls of the skyscraper only added to the horror of the situation. The snowboarder, limping, walked towards his mates, saying that this was not the time for girls. His words were accompanied by a tired look and a resolute demeanor, as if he had more important concerns than dealing with women in a world filled with danger. The snowboarder, moaning in pain, showed his leg with the sword sticking out of it to the others. His suffering and despair were conveyed in his every movement, and the picture of the shattered sword created a grim image in this cold and merciless landscape. The man was bleeding, and his pierced leg looked like it had been wounded by a predator's fang. The man in the green jacket said he would patch up with the old man, to which the gray-haired man replied that no one allowed the guy to do so. There was uncertainty and some tension in the conversation between them, as if each of them had a different view of the rules and realities of survival in this harsh world. The guy with the blue makeup started screaming at the bloody butcher, ordering him to look at the snowboarder's leg. His anger and despair resounded in his every word, and his shouting was an attempt to draw attention to the horrible situation of his injured leg. In this dystopian world, one's own defenselessness forced people to extreme measures. The snowboarder said it required treatment, to which Yonak only looked on with a smirk, hiding his hands in his waistcoat pockets. There was something cold and indifferent in his smile, as if in this world justice and compassion were a luxury he had long since lost. It was obvious that no one was going to deal with the guy's bleeding wound. The gray-haired man said with indifference that if his leg was the problem, he could chop it off at the ankle. His cold-blooded suggestion reflected the raw realism and rigidity of a harsh world where decisions are made according to the rigid logic of survival. The mad butcher said that if the problem was in the brain that sends the pain signal, he could chop the guy's head off. His words sounded like a grim play on words, expressing a reckless and sadistic nature ready to take extreme measures in this troubled world. The old man's gaze was full of madness, and his grin expressed the inadequacy of a maniac. The snowboarder pulled a knife out of his pocket and said that the man was not all right in the head. His gesture with the knife expressed warning and threat, as if he was ready to defend himself in this dangerous environment, where the mosaic of the human psyche was no less frightening than a zombie attack. The guy in blue makeup started charging at the old man, saying that he thought he was a big shot because he was being paid off. The veins on his face were ballooning, and his gaze was filled with hatred and insanity. The snowboarder's hit and run was a mixture of aggression and resentment, creating a moment of tension in this chaotic world, where not only zombies but humans are becoming a threat. The boy was suddenly silent, staring at something below his face. His expression reflected amazement or even surprise, as if he had suddenly discovered something unusual or unexpected in his surroundings. The instantaneous change in the man's behavior created an atmosphere of uncertainty and intrigue. The gray-haired sadist held a large kitchen knife to the guy's throat. This moment of tension and fear reflected the menace in the snowboarder's eyes, creating an eerie look in this disturbing scene where human cruelty became as threatening a factor as the rising dead. The maniacal butcher said with disproportionate anger that he was giving everyone 3 seconds. His voice was threatening, as if every second was filled with explosive energy, and he was ready to smash the obstacles in his way at any moment. The man's knife was getting closer and closer to the skin of the guy in the green jacket. At that moment, the tension reached its peak. Every millimeter of the knife's approach created a sense of imminent threat, and the air was filled with an intimidating atmosphere. The old sadist shouted that everyone who had nothing to do with him should disappear. His voice pierced the air, filling it with sinister energy, as if he were challenging anyone who dared to enter his territory. The injured snowboarder swallowed his saliva pitifully at the realization that he could die now. In that moment, his pain and helplessness were reflected in that quiet, pitiful sound, emphasizing the fragility of human nature in a harsh world where even every breath becomes a struggle for survival. Yonak loomed over the poor man, who was already wet with sweat. There was a sense of added menace in his shadow, like the raw fear of the coming cold coming from this ruthless man in this chaotic and ruthless world. The man said the snowboarder had 1 second left and asked if he wanted to die with his scalp behind him. There was an incredible overlay of cruelty in his threatening question, emphasizing the ruthless nature of this dystopian world. He was grinning with all his might, like a mad clown who only craved human flesh. Someone pulled the stunned guy back by his green jacket, saying that he was completely out of his mind. This abrupt and rude gesture and equally rude comment seemed like an attempt to bring reality back into this madness caused by the dramatic circumstances of survival. A man with a torn mouth threw a snowboarder back into the snow, saying that he had forgotten they needed to deliver an order. In this ridiculous and grim moment of survival against the backdrop of the zombie apocalypse, there was an ironic reminder that even in the strangest of situations, human life and responsibilities continue to exist. The black-haired guy apologized to the gray-haired butcher, saying that the snowboarder hadn't participated in the outing for a long time. There was a note of humility and understanding in his apology, as if he was trying to diffuse the tense situation and bring understanding to the situation. The man, wiping his knife on his waistcoat, suggested that the company get rid of the loser, saying that he was dragging the couriers down. There was a sense of menace and uncompromisingness in his suggestion, as if in this ruthless world, even one's own comrades could become a target of danger. The man with the braces, stammering, said that they needed the snowboarder because he was a master of his craft. The old maniac replied that they could tell from the russet-haired guy that he was crazy. In this conversation, there was a certain dynamic and internal dissonance between the recognition of mastery and the presence of oddities in the snowboarder's behavior. The man with the blue makeup tried to rise. His movements reflected effort and perseverance in a situation where every step could be an obstacle, and where even getting up could be an act of survival in a zombie apocalypse. The skateboarder was immediately swung at by the black-haired man, causing the former to startle. This unexpected gesture created tension, emphasizing the unpredictability of relationships in this chaotic world, where every moment can be a challenge. The guy in the green jacket flew backwards, flipping over on his stomach. This sudden moment of imbalance added colors of chaos to a scenario where even a momentary loss of control over one's body could lead to serious consequences. The courier in the blue hoodie told the butcher that they would make sure that the injured man could no longer participate in the outings. There was confidence and determination in his words, as if there was no room in this dark world for those who become obstacles to the group's work. The madman waved a knife and said that the couriers could send the loser again, so that the maniac could count how many bones were in his body. This menacing statement conveyed a harsh threat and an air of lawlessness where even sinister humor becomes part of the survival stress. The man in the waistcoat turned to the wounded boy, saying through gritted teeth that they would see each other again. His voice was a mixture of menace and foreboding, as if this meeting would be only the beginning of more complex and dangerous events in their dark world. The exhausted snowboarder lay on the snow and looked fearfully at the smiling butcher. This moment of disbelief and fear reflected helplessness in the face of the ruthless threat before him. The two girls stood silently in front of the gray-haired madman, who was looking at them intently. There was a tense atmosphere in this silent confrontation, as if looks spoke more than words, and every breath emphasized the uncertainty in this dangerous world. The man asked the women what they were standing still for, and said that he always welcomed these girls, calling them with a finger gesture. One could sense irony or even mockery in his words, creating an ambiguous mood in this tense environment. The butcher told them to go inside, and they just looked at him sadly. The girls didn't know what to expect from this weirdo, and they didn't even know what to expect from him, and this they had no idea what might be waiting for them next. The man with the braces on his mouth told the old maniac that they would come for the girls tomorrow, to which the man replied in the negative. In this exchange of words, there was a certain drama and foreshadowing of a possible conflict, as if each side had its own plans and intentions. At that time, the girls had already entered the butcher's den. Ju tapped his huge knife on the snowmobile and told his companion to leave it here, and the gray-haired man would bring the girls back himself later. There was confidence and authority in this moment, as if Ju had control over the situation and future plans. The guy in the blue hoodie refused such an offer, saying that they might have a problem if the girls went somewhere else, to which the crazy man replied that he would try to finish everything faster, and ordered the group to get on. There was an unsettling note in this exchange of words, emphasizing the danger and tension in a situation where every decision could affect the course of events. The gray-haired butcher disappeared behind the peeled curtain and slammed the door behind him. At this point, his actions created a mysterious atmosphere, as if the secrets or dangers of this dark world might lurk behind that door. At this time, the snowboarder rose to his feet, holding his head. His movements expressed pain and bewilderment, as if he had just been through something difficult and was barely recovering from the unpleasant event. The black-haired courier gave him an angry look, as if he didn't want the guy in the green jacket to wake up at all. The man in blue makeup called out to the guy with the torn mouth. His call added tension to the atmosphere, as if at this moment the secrets and dangers that separated them were beginning to unfold. The black-haired man grabbed the snowboarder's jaw like a yard dog, squeezing harder and harder. This moment reflected not only physical pain, but also dominance, emphasizing ruthlessness in this zombie-infested world. The enraged courier threatened the injured guy that if he opened his mouth again without his permission, the snowboarder would be downgraded to a slave. His angry words contained not only a threat, but also a clear desire to control and suppress those around him. The black-gloved hand trembled with tension, restraining the poor man's jaw as he asked for forgiveness for what had happened. In this moment, the transfer of power and helplessness created an atmosphere filled with anxiety and tension. The snowboarder coughed and drooled on the snow as his commander dragged him by the arm along the ground. The moment conveyed not only physical pain, but also despair and decay at the harsh reality of this zombie world. The group of couriers drove further and further away from the abandoned skyscraper. Their departure emphasized the incredible danger and tension around them, creating a sense of temporary relief. The frightened women stood before the man, unsure of what to do. Their troubled eyes reflected uncertainty and fear, as if they were facing a choice that could change the course of their fate in this dark world. Each of the girls stood rubbing their hands together with nerves, guessing what awaited them. Their hesitant gestures and tense facial expressions reflected their inner anxieties and anticipation of something unknown in this zombie-infested world. The old merismatic grinned his bestial grin, already imagining these ladies in his meat masterpieces. In his grin, he read sinister plans that stirred the imagination and filled the air with unbearable tension. The man laughed sinisterly and pointed his finger at the black-haired maiden, ordering her to approach him. At that moment, there was an unholy aura in the air, and his command sounded like dark notes in a sinister symphony. The long-haired girl immediately moved towards the maniac, not wanting to anger him. The long-haired girl immediately moved towards the maniac, not wishing to anger him, and her movements were subdued by her fear of the madman and her willingness to obey his ominous instructions. The butcher ordered his second victim to go to the first floor and cut up the meat. His voice sounded like an ominous command, filling the air with menace and emphasizing his power over the situation. The anxious girls began to whisper among themselves, exchanging frightened glances and uncertainty in the face of the butcher's ominous instructions. The atmosphere of tension and anxiety became palpable in their whispers. The madman came close to the women, leaning closer and closer to them, and asked what they were doing here. His approach filled the air with uncertainty and anxious anticipation of an answer before the unpredictable creature. The madman ironically said that he would certainly not eat the poor people, that it was a beautiful day and they were here to give each other happiness. His words sounded unusually sarcastic, adding mystery to the atmosphere. The man handed his guest his kitchen knife and said that if anyone spoiled his mood, he would be held responsible. This action was threatening, creating tension in the air. The gray-haired butcher squeezed the knife girl's hand with his own and looked into her eyes to ask if it was wrong. There was a strange mixture of roughness and mystery in his gestures, emphasizing his dominance in this strange interaction. The dark-haired woman trembled at the actions and intonation of the mysterious man, not realizing where all this was leading. Her eyes reflected fear and bewilderment, creating an atmosphere of unpredictability and tension. The smiling maniac pushed the poor woman, ordering her to chop samgyeopsal, a popular Korean dish. The mixture of eerie reality and bizarre requests created a gloomy atmosphere all around. The angry butcher turned to the blonde-haired lady and asked why she stood up, expressing his annoyance. His furious look was even more frightening and repulsive, making her wonder for the 100th time if the girl was there. The woman clutched the table, feeling its surface cold beneath her trembling hands. She tried to hide her fear when the old maniac invited her in, slowly raising his hand and beckoning her towards a mysterious future. Her eyes reflected fear and bewilderment, mixed with indecision. The girl gripped the table tighter and tighter, feeling the wood sink into her trembling palms. Drops of sweat rolled down her disheveled hair, onto her forehead, and dripped onto the floor, emphasizing the tension in the air. Traces of fear flickered in her eyes, and her heart beat faster than ever. The poor girl began to remember the advice of her dark-haired colleague, which sounded like a thread leading her out of the dark forest of fear. The words of strength, determination, and the need to remain calm, even in the most difficult situations, rang in her ears. Memories of those words were her support in this moment. That girl insisted that in this situation it was better not to resist the man, but instead suggested that she try to free her thoughts and imagine herself as a submissive zombie to keep calm and perhaps avoid danger. This advice sounded like a self-defense strategy in an atmosphere of threat and chaos. The mentor emphasized that resistance can only exacerbate the situation by angering the abusers. While advising against active resistance, she argued that sometimes inaction can be a strategy to avoid additional problems and maintain safety in difficult circumstances. The dark-haired girl asked her companion if she understood, and there was only a silent nod of agreement. Under her tense gaze, her colleague looked at her blonde friend intently, waiting for an answer. Her interlocutor, sitting in anticipation, only nodded silently, confirming her agreement with what she was advised in the situation. The tension in the car was building, and both girls' gazes remained tense, ready for any turn of events. The man roughly grabbed the blonde girl by the hair and put her back against his stomach. The poor girl did not even have time to react, as she immediately found herself pressed against the dusty tabletop. At that moment, the girl felt fear for herself and her friend, who had been sent to another room. The old man in the waistcoat piled his whole body on top of the girl, pressing her harder and harder into the table. The poor girl had no choice but to endure this horror and hope for a quick end. The man was enjoying himself in the meantime. The gray-haired madman bent over his victim's head and began to sniff his victim's scent, saying that he had been inhaling nothing but the aromas of meat for a month now. Such a strange fetish only increased the degree of madness in the room. The shivering girl lay on the cold bollard, her body trembling with fear. The woman's eyes expressed a pitiful look as she watched the unhealthy man's actions, remaining in a helpless pose on the hard wooden surface. The old lunatic lifted his head up, his eyes savoring the subtle scent of his victim, as if it were something satisfying and strangely calming to him. The man smiled broadly, anticipating the delicious pâté that would come out of this beauty. He said that the murderous odor emanating from the girl evokes strange emotions in him, driving him to a state of inadequacy. His perverted fantasies consume his mind, and the madness is clearly reflected in his eyes as he savors the thought of the victim. The troop of couriers continued to rush down the snowy slopes, leaving their tracks in the snow. The icy wind whispered their stories, but they were focused, ready for the next challenge in this ruthless world. The three men sat in the car, tensely sensing the situation. While the snowboarder looked out the window of the vehicle with a resentful look, inside there was an atmosphere of anxiety and unresolved conflicts. The russet-haired guy, scrunching up his face, noticing the strange look of the guy with the braces on his torn mouth, decided to address him, as if wanting to find out what could be so important about their current situation. The guy with the blue makeup bit his lip in anger, saying that he was consistently following all of Taejin's orders, showing his loyalty and determination. The injured snowboarder's words had a note of mockery and charge in them, as if he was displeased about something. The man was excited at the prospect that his subordinates might form an opinion of him by seeing him beaten in front of everyone, and it caused him mixed emotions of excitement and anxiety for his influence and authority. The black-haired guy only sat silently beside him, not reacting to the snowboarder's words. The snowboarder, not yet finished talking about his experiences, suddenly felt something hard and painful hit him in the face. From such a powerful blow, there was a loud sound that was heard by everyone. As the man was expressing his excitement about what the slaves might think of him, the blow to the snowboarder's face came so suddenly that he didn't even have time to finish his worries. The force of the blow forced him to bend over in severe pain, and the guy's arm instantly went up in an attempt to protect his face from additional blows. The red stain on his arm and face spoke of the man's strength and inner suffering. On Taejin's chest hung several mysterious badges, each seemingly charged with history. The different shapes and sizes suggested that each badge had its own unique significance, as if locking away a piece of his past or ambitions. Echoes of light flickered on them, as if to emphasize the mystery of this man and his dark, enigmatic past. A disgruntled driver asked not to pour blood on the car, claiming it would be painful to clean up afterwards, while a snowboarder whimpered in pain, reminding everyone of the price to pay for doing such difficult and dangerous work. The driver laughed and told the wounded guy that he'd gotten one badge and gone straight to the wrong places, causing his share of chaos in this snowy hell. The russet-haired man just wiped the blood with a tissue, choking back tears. Taejin turned sharply to the snowboarder, calling him a loser and adding a hint of his recent mistakes. His gaze was as embittered as ever, and his voice was rough and commanding, as if he wanted to prove something to the stupid boy. Daijin, squinting his eyes, began to reveal that Ju Young-ak used to be a cop, and even an investigator with a super dickish temper, claiming that now that Ju has something else on his mind, his old profession has become unfit for him. He was known for his ruthless investigative method, which involved unconventional approaches and often broke the law. His extraordinary flair was noted, but his methods were often controversial and led to scandals. Yonak was single-minded and often ignored the opinions of his colleagues in favor of his own morality. Yonak tyrannized civilians both because of their appearance and because of his own problems at home. His ruthless methods aroused fear and resentment, and his overconfidence gave him the opportunity to humiliate those around him, using any vulnerability to display his power. Such displays of aggression made him inadequate and dangerous to others. After being exiled to the provinces for multiple offenses, the man lost his temper and drank himself to death. Disillusioned and infuriated, Yonak began his bloody path of fire. He turned a peaceful village into ruins, claimed the lives of more than 30 people, becoming a ruthless agent of destruction in response to his own failures. His inner demon roamed the grim streets of the province, leaving behind only a trail of chaos and death. The snowboarder, feeling uneasy, raised his hand to ask a question, only to be met with a gesture from Taejin that warned him against interfering with a dangerous psychopath. The man's look was so convincing that the question froze in the air, unable to find its sound. The guy with the torn mouth clarified that the psychopath has essentially become a sort of zombie killer, fighting zombies and keeping the group safe. Their deals with him involve an exchange of favors. He keeps them safe from zombies, and they give him something in return. The man revealed that there were 3 legendary psychopaths around Seoul who had left their mark with horrible deeds. However, Daejin did not hesitate to clarify that there was also an underground community of ex-cons who had settled in the dark basements of the prison. Here, in this sinister hideout, lurks a peculiar group representing a dangerous association of survivors in this cruel new world. Daejin claims that these 3 legendary psychopaths have already intercepted hundreds, if not thousands, of zombies. Their reputation in the world of survivors emphasizes their expertise and ruthless abilities in dealing with these walking horrors. A black-haired guy asks a snowboarder if he knows that the rising dead from the lower neighborhoods started to appear en masse after the snow melted. Apparently, this fact has caused new problems in their survival community. Daejin asks the russet-haired guy where he thinks the zombies are headed, and warns that Seoul is under a threat that only the strongest will be able to handle. Perhaps he's emphasizing the importance of fighting the rising dead to keep the city safe. Daejin expresses apathy towards the identity of the maniac, emphasizing that it is important to him that someone capable of protecting the city takes on that role, regardless of their character or methods. All that matters is that the threat to the safety of the city is removed as soon as possible. The man with the torn mouth ordered the wounded guy not to even breathe towards Yonika and silently took the girls to leave. With a hard look and without words, he made it clear that now was not the time for unnecessary questions, but for action. The russet-haired boy lowered his eyes in submission, expressing his understanding of Daejin's order. He apologized for his earlier concern, admitting that his actions had been inappropriate. There was a timidity in his voice, and he looked ready to comply without further ado. The guy who said this with his mouth torn open expressed his anxiety about the inadequate maniac, emphasizing that he was more worried about the maniac than the injured snowboarder. His expression was marked by tension and seriousness, reflecting concern about the maniac's actions. The man expressed his dismay that the gray-haired butcher only showed courtesy and favor at moments of killing, emphasizing his danger and unpredictability in different situations. In his words, his concern about the unstable behavior of the butcher resounded. The car, waggling between the snow-covered trees, expressed swiftness and strength, like a fearless warrior penetrating through the snow curtains. Its wheels whipped up a dusting of fresh snow, leaving behind bright white streaks against the wintry landscape. The sound of the engine mingled with the rumble of the wind, creating an atmosphere of unstoppable motion in this winter adventure. The man in the green jacket noticed the 2 girls standing near the abandoned building. He raised his eyebrows, staring at them, as if trying to figure out their intentions. His gaze flickered in the cold air, and the silence around them intensified, as if it were a foretaste of something unusual. The wind swirled through every crevice, blowing the 2 shivering women around the abandoned building. They hugged their shoulders, trying to shield themselves from the freezing cold. Their breath visibly blew a white cloud into the air, creating an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty in this wintry landscape. The blonde girl's hands were dotted with incomprehensible cuts, as if she were wading through something dangerous or fighting something sinister. Blood formed red marks on her snow-white skin, emphasizing the incredible tension of the moment. The ladies, with the ravenous cold enveloping them, could barely keep their balance despite their constantly shivering legs. Their hands, covered with incomprehensible cuts, clenched in helpless attempts to keep warm. The wind, like a ferocious dog, continued its relentless attack, penetrating through their clothes and leaving frozen marks on their skin. In such agony they could barely stand, and waited longingly for this agonizing cold to disappear. The guy with the blue makeup started to get angry at the maniac, realizing that he was the one who had done this to their girls.